On a Tuesday morning in late September of 1987, a brand new Caterpillar 637 scraper went over the edge of a clay embankment on Highway 34 construction site in Cass County, Nebraska, and didn't stop moving until it had buried itself 15 feet deep in the kind of mud that doesn't let go of anything. The machine weighed 97,000 pounds empty. With the load of dirt it had been carrying when the bank gave way, the recovery crew estimated it closer to 120,000 pounds. It had rolled twice on the way down, shearing off the cab's right side and snapping the push tractor's hitch connection clean through. The operator, a young man named Dennis Folds, had jumped at the last possible second and walked away with a broken collarbone and a story he would spend the rest of his working life trying to forget. The scraper was not so fortunate. It sat at the bottom of that embankment at roughly a 40-degree tilt, its front bowl buried to the rim, its rear tires submerged past the axle hubs, sitting in a soup of blue clay and groundwater that had been pooling in that low spot for the better part of 3 weeks of October rain. The construction company was Meridian Earthworks out of Lincoln. They had a completion deadline on the highway contract that was already tight before this happened. Every day that scraper sat in that hole was a day they were paying penalties and falling further behind. They needed it out. They needed it out fast. So they called the best heavy recovery operation in the state. Continental Recovery had been working the Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas corridor since 1969, 18 years in the business. Their lead man was a fellow named Arthur Gaines, 51 years old, built like a man who had spent his entire adult life around heavy iron because he had. Arthur had recovered overturned cranes, extracted semi-trucks from flooded river crossings, pulled equipment out of situations that other companies wouldn't even come out to look at. He drove a company pickup with 200,000 miles on it and kept a laminated card in his wallet with every cable rating, pulley multiplier, and soil resistance formula he'd ever needed. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of man you called when something very heavy was stuck somewhere it shouldn't be. Arthur arrived at the site at 7 in the morning, walked the edge of the embankment twice, got down on one knee, and put his hand in the mud at the base of the slope and stood up. He called his dispatcher and told him to bring the big crane, the Liebherr LTM 1100, a 100-ton all-terrain unit that was the largest piece of lift equipment Continental owned. He also ordered 2 heavy winch trucks and 4 ground anchors rated for 30 tons each. He told the site foreman he'd have the scraper on flat ground before end of shift. That was at 7 in the morning. By 2 in the afternoon, Arthur Gaines was sitting on the running board of his pickup truck in the rain, staring at the mud, and the scraper was still exactly where it had been when he arrived. Let me tell you what went wrong, because it matters to everything that comes after. The crane had positioned perfectly. The rigging was correct. The lift points on the scraper's frame were solid. Arthur had done everything right by the book, his book, and every book the industry had written on the subject of heavy lift recovery. The first attempt, a straight vertical lift combined with a forward pull from one of the winch trucks, had come within what Arthur estimated was about 40,000 pounds of breaking the machine free from the mud's suction. Close, but not enough. The cable loads were already near their rated limits. Pushing harder meant risking a catastrophic failure. The second attempt used both winch trucks in tandem with the crane, a 3-point pull that, in theory, should have generated enough combined force to break any reasonable suction seal. In practice, what it generated was a slow, grinding, deeply concerning sound from the crane's main boom that made Arthur's stomach drop, followed by the left rear tire of the scraper pulling free of the mud, and then immediately sinking back in 6 inches deeper as the suction redistributed. They had made the problem worse. The third attempt involved digging. Arthur brought in a track hoe from the construction site and spent 2 hours trying to excavate the mud away from the scraper's buried bowl. The clay was so saturated that it collapsed back into the hole almost as fast as the track hoe could remove it. At one point, the track hoe itself started showing signs of instability on the embankment edge, and Arthur called that off before he had 2 machines in the hole instead of 1. By the time he sat down on that running board, he had burned through 6 hours of daylight, 2 broken synthetic cables, each one rated at 40 tons, and what he would later describe, in private and to very few people, as every idea he had. The crane operator was asking if they wanted to reposition. The winch truck drivers were waiting. The Meridian site foreman was standing at the edge of the embankment with his arms crossed and a look on his face that Arthur had seen before, on the faces of men who were calculating how much this was going to cost them. Arthur told them all to take a break. He needed to think. That was when the old flatbed truck pulled off Highway 34 and parked on the gravel shoulder about 100 yards back from the site perimeter. Now let me tell you about Harold Spence before I tell you what was on that flatbed, because understanding the man is the only way to understand what happened next. Harold was 74 years old and had farmed 320 acres of Cass County ground his entire adult life. His grandfather, August Spence, had homesteaded that same ground in 1891, broken the original sod with a horse-drawn plow, and built the first farmhouse from lumber he'd hauled by wagon from Plattsmouth. August had been a methodical man, a German immigrant who believed that things built properly and maintained faithfully would outlast everything, including the men who built them. He passed that belief to Harold's father, who passed it to Harold, and Harold had spent 50 years proving it correct in ways small and large across his 320 acres. Harold didn't drive new equipment. He'd never taken a loan he couldn't pay off in a single planting season. He maintained every tool he owned with the kind of regular, unhurried attention that most modern men reserve for nothing at all. There were implements in his shed that were older than most of the roads in Cass County, and every one of them worked because Harold had never let them stop working. He'd been driving past the construction site for 3 weeks, watching the highway project from the cab of his truck the way farmers watch anything happening on land near their own, with a quiet, evaluating patience. He'd seen the scraper go in. He'd watched the crane arrive that morning. He'd driven past twice during the recovery attempts, slowing but not stopping, watching through the window. He'd stopped at the diner in Weeping Water for lunch and driven back. And when he pulled off at 2 in the afternoon and sat in his truck watching Arthur Gaines sit on that running board in the rain, something settled into a decision. Harold climbed out of his truck, walked up to the site perimeter, and asked the flagman to let him through. The flagman looked at him, a 74-year-old man in a canvas coat and rubber boots, gray-haired, unhurried, and then looked back at the supervisor, who waved him through because at that point no one was in a mood to argue with anyone about anything. Harold walked to where Arthur was sitting and looked down at the mud and the buried scraper and then back at Arthur. He didn't introduce himself immediately. He just looked at the situation for a long moment, the way men do when they are actually thinking and not just appearing to think. Then he said, "You're fighting the suction wrong." Arthur looked up at him. His expression was the expression of a man who has been awake since 5 in the morning, failed 3 times at a job he's never failed at before, and is now being approached by a retired farmer in rubber boots. "How's that?" Arthur said. "You're pulling against it. Straight up, straight out. Every time you load that suction seal, it fights you harder." Harold nodded at the embankment. "Clay like that, saturated like that, it doesn't release under direct tension. It compresses, seals tighter. You need to shear it, not pull it. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Shear it. Break the bond at the edges first. Work around the perimeter before you try to lift the center. The mud's holding that machine like a suction cup. You break the rim of the cup before you pull the center. It releases. Arthur stood up. He was 6 inches taller than Harold and probably outweighed him by 50 pounds. He looked at the man for a moment with the particular expression of someone trying to determine whether they're hearing something worth hearing or something they should politely dismiss. "And you know this how?" Arthur said. Harold looked at him evenly. "Come take a look at what's on my flatbed." What was on Harold Spence's flatbed was the reason this story is still told in Cass County. It was a 1912 Case steam traction engine, 22 tons of iron and brass and hand-fitted steel, a machine that had been manufactured the same year the Titanic was launched, in a factory in Racine, Wisconsin, by men who understood that the work they were building for was hard work, real work, the kind of work that didn't allow for fragile things. The boiler was upright and lagged in wood and iron bands. The single rear drive wheel, nearly 6 feet in diameter, was fitted with flat steel grousers, cleats in modern terms, each one 4 inches wide and hand-forged, designed to grip soft ground the way fingers grip rope. The machine had no rubber anywhere on it. It was iron all the way to the earth. August Spence had purchased the engine in 1914 from a threshing crew that was dissolving, paid $400 for a machine that had cost over $2,000 new. He'd used it for threshing, for belt work, for pulling stumps out of fields he was breaking for new ground, and on at least 3 documented occasions that the family still talked about, for pulling other farmers' equipment out of situations that nothing else could handle. Harold's father had maintained it through the 1930s and 1940s, keeping it running through the Depression years when there was no money for repairs, by improvising, fabricating, and solving problems with whatever materials were at hand. Harold had inherited the engine in 1961 and continued what his father and grandfather had started, which was the faithful, patient maintenance of a machine that rewarded faithfulness with performance. He had fired it up that morning before he drove past the highway site. It was ready to work. Arthur Gaines walked around that steam engine twice without saying anything. He was an equipment man, and whatever else he was thinking, he was clearly thinking about what he was looking at. The drive wheel alone was remarkable. The footprint it presented to the ground was unlike anything in his modern fleet. Where his winch trucks put their power through rubber tires on a surface that could give way, that cast-iron wheel with its forged grousers would press into soft ground and grip it at a mechanical level, the cleats finding purchase that rubber could never find. "What's your drawbar pull?" Arthur asked finally. "About 12,000 pounds continuous," Harold said. "More than that in short bursts, but 12,000 is what you can count on all day." Arthur looked at the buried scraper, looked at the crane, looked back at the steam engine. "My crane can generate 100 tons of lift," he said. "You're telling me 12,000 pounds is going to make a difference?" "I'm telling you that 12,000 pounds applied the right way, at the right angle, at the right point in the suction cycle, will do what 200,000 pounds applied the wrong way won't." Harold paused. "Your crane's been loading that suction seal and letting it relax, loading it and letting it relax. Every time it relaxes, the clay fills back in tighter. You need to hold continuous lateral tension at the perimeter while the crane lifts. Break the seal at the edges while you lift the center. The steam engine can hold that lateral pull steady, no surging, no shock loading, for as long as it takes." Arthur was quiet for a long time. His crew was watching from a distance. The site foreman had walked over and was standing nearby, listening. Then Arthur said, Show me how you'd rig it." What followed over the next 90 minutes was one of the most methodical equipment setups that anyone on that site had ever watched. Harold knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing each piece of it. He positioned the steam engine at an angle to the buried scraper, not straight back, not perpendicular, but at a calculated diagonal that would apply lateral force to the right front corner of the machine's bowl, the point where, Harold explained, the suction seal was thinnest because of the way the scraper had tilted on impact. He ran his chain, old iron chain, the same chain his grandfather had used, thick-linked and dark with oil and age, from the steam engine's drawbar through a redirecting snatch block bolted to a ground anchor, then to the scraper's front frame rail. The geometry was deliberate, worked out in Harold's head with the casual precision of a man who has done this kind of calculation so many times that it no longer requires effort, only attention. He explained each step to Arthur without being asked, not lecturing, just talking, the way a man talks when he's sharing something he thinks the other person needs to know. "The continuous pull breaks the seal gradually," Harold said, securing the chain to the frame rail with a shackle that was older than Arthur's career. "Your crane lifts, I pull lateral. The suction releases from the corner back. Like peeling tape, you don't rip it, you peel it." Arthur had repositioned his crane. His crew had re-rigged the lift points. Everyone was in position. Harold climbed up onto the steam engine's operator platform, a simple iron seat above the controls, no cab, no windshield, nothing between him and the rain, and opened the throttle. The boiler had been holding pressure. The drive wheel began to turn. The chain lifted off the ground link by link, tightening until it hung taut between the engine and the scraper. The steam engine didn't surge, it didn't jerk, it simply pulled, a steady, patient, continuous force that didn't waver and didn't give back a single inch of what it gained. Arthur gave the signal. The crane began to lift. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened. The chain hummed. The crane boom flexed slightly under load. The mud around the scraper's bowl showed no movement. Then, at the front right corner, a crack appeared in the clay. A thin line running along the edge of the buried bowl, maybe 18 inches long. The mud along that line shifted. Not much, a quarter inch, half an inch, but it shifted. The suction seal at the corner was breaking. The crack spread. Slowly, following the perimeter of the bowl, moving from the front corner backward along the right side. The sound it made was like someone opening a very large, very reluctant jar. Then the scraper moved. Not dramatically, not with a great lurch or a sudden release. It moved the way something moves when the thing holding it down finally decides to let go. Gradually, and then all at once. The front lifted first, following the crane, while Harold's lateral pull kept the suction breaking at the rim. The bowl came clear of the mud with a sound that the Meridian site foreman would describe 3 days later at the diner in Weeping Water as the most satisfying sound he had ever heard in 20 years of construction work. 12 minutes from the moment Harold opened the throttle to the moment the scraper's rear tires cleared the mud and sat on solid clay. 12 minutes after 6 hours of failure. Arthur Gaines stood at the edge of the embankment and watched his crane crew guide the scraper to flat ground. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he walked over to where Harold was throttling the steam engine down, the drive wheel slowing, the boiler settling back into its idle rhythm. "I owe you an explanation," Arthur said. Harold looked at him. "I've been doing this work for 18 years. I've never seen that technique." Harold climbed down from the platform. He was 74 years old, and he moved like it, carefully, one step at a time. "It's not a technique," he said. "It's just physics. Suction breaks at the perimeter before it breaks at the center. That's always been true. My grandfather learned it working horses. You can't overpower a suction seal with a horse team, so you had to outsmart it. Break it from the outside in. He looked at the steam engine. This machine is slow. It's always been slow. But slow and steady means you don't shock load the chain. You don't surge the suction seal. You just hold the pressure and let the physics work. Arthur looked at the steam engine the way a man looks at something he's going to be thinking about for a long time. "How old is it?" he said. "Built in 1912. My grandfather bought it in 1914. And it still pulls like that. It pulls like that because we never stopped taking care of it." Harold picked up his chain and began to coil it, link by link, the way you coil something you intend to use again. People stopped taking care of these machines because new machines came along that were faster and easier. And most of the time, faster and easier is exactly what you need. But not every time. Arthur reached into his shirt pocket and took out a business card. Harold looked at it. "I travel less than I used to," Harold said. "I'm not asking you to travel. I'm asking if I can come out to your place sometime. I want to understand what you just did. Not just the technique, the thinking behind it. How you read the situation. How you knew where the seal was thinnest." Arthur paused. "The industry is forgetting things. Every year, the men who understood this work at its roots retire or die, and nobody's written it down. I don't want to be one of the people who let it disappear." Harold looked at the card for a moment. Then he put it in his coat pocket. "Come on a Saturday," he said. "I'll show you what I know." In the years after, Arthur Gaines drove out to the Spence farm 6 times. He brought notebooks and asked questions that Harold answered plainly and without flourish, the way men answer questions when they're not trying to impress anyone, only trying to be accurate. He wrote down the principles: suction seal mechanics, perimeter release sequencing, the specific conditions under which continuous low-force tension outperforms high-force shock loading, and eventually worked them into the training materials he used with his own crew. He never forgot where he'd learned them. Harold Spence kept farming until 1994, when his knees made the decision for him. He sold his modern equipment at auction, but kept the steam engine in the shed, covered with a canvas tarp, maintained monthly the same way it had been maintained since 1914. He told his son Raymond that the machine was not to be sold, not to be scrapped, and not to be parked somewhere decorative where people could look at it without understanding what it was. "It's a working machine," Harold said. "It doesn't belong in a museum. It belongs where someone might need it." Harold died in 2001 at the age of 88, in the same farmhouse his grandfather had built from Plattsmouth lumber in the 1890s. Raymond kept the engine running. His son keeps it running today. The chain is still coiled on the drawbar, oiled and ready, because that is how it has always been kept. And some habits, once established by men who understood what they were doing, deserve to outlast the men themselves. There is a version of this story where Arthur Gaines's equipment wins and the old man goes home without being needed. That version happens on dry ground, in good conditions, on a normal day. On that Tuesday in September of 1987, the ground was wet, the conditions were wrong, and it was anything but a normal day. And on that day, 120,000 pounds of modern machinery sat helpless in the mud, while 22 tons of 1912 iron pulled it out in 12 minutes. Not because the old machine was stronger, it wasn't. Not because the old man was smarter, he'd just had longer to learn. The mud didn't care about the crane's rated capacity. The mud didn't care about the synthetic cables, or the precision rigging, or the 18 years of professional experience. The mud cared about one thing only: whether the force being applied to it was the right kind of force, applied at the right place, in the right way. Harold Spence knew what kind of force that was. His grandfather had taught his father had taught him. And on a rainy Tuesday in Cass County, Nebraska, he showed a room full of modern professionals something that no training course in their industry had ever covered. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for the world to remember why they were made. What stays with me about Harold Spence isn't the steam engine. It's the fact that he drove past that site twice before he stopped. He wasn't in a hurry to prove anything. He watched. He thought. He made sure he understood the problem before he offered the solution. That kind of patience, real patience, not the kind you perform, but the kind that comes from knowing you don't need to rush, is almost impossible to teach. You either have it or you don't. Harold had it because 3 generations of his family had needed it. That's the part no machine can carry. Only people can. If this story moved something in you, hit like, drop one word in the comments that describes Harold, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and share this with someone who still believes older always means weaker. Would you like me to write the YouTube video description with SEO keywords and hashtags for this one as well?